Life is full of ups and downs, good seasons and bad seasons. And yet, one of the things we see in the life of Abraham is that in all of those seasons, both the good and the bad, God's grace is always present with us. The story of Abraham is, of course, the story of Abraham and his faith, but it's also the story of God's grace that comes and meets us in all situations of life. As we come to Genesis chapter 21, we're going to be looking at the entirety of this chapter. And what we're going to see is at the beginning of the story, we have a cause of celebration and joy. There's a reminder of all that God has said and all that he's been faithful to. There's celebration. There's really one of the high points of Abraham's life. And then immediately after that comes one of the confusing times in God's life. And I think for many of us, we know what that's like. You go from the mountain to the valley, from the time of great excitement to the time of confusion. What is God up to? What am I supposed to do? How should I think about this? And then that continues on, and we look finally at Hagar and her complete destitution and her hopelessness. And what we see is that in every season of life, be it the good times or the bad times or just plain old the confusing times, God comes to us and he makes his grace known in our lives. And so as we begin this lesson, we'll again look at each of those scenes. We'll look at the birth of Isaac and the cause of joy that was, and then we'll look at the turn with Ishmael and what happens there, and Sarah's demand that Abraham get rid of his son Ishmael and just kick him out. And then finally we'll see Ishmael and Hagar in the wilderness and God's grace as he comes to them as well. As we begin this, we look at God's grace and our joys, and the first thing that we see in the story is the emphasis that's being put on God keeping his words. So you'll see there the first question under God keeps his words. What phrase do you see repeated in the first two verses of this chapter? And if you're paying close attention, you're going to read things that basically say God said. As he said, as he's spoken, of which God spoke to him. And we're going to see these phrases kind of repeated several times in these first two verses to emphasize the fact that what is happening now is exactly what God said was going to happen. God did exactly what he said he was going to do. And then in the next few verses, we see that Abraham obeys God's word. And he does exactly what he's been told to do earlier in the story. So he'd been told to name the child Isaac. He, of course, names the child Isaac. On the 8th day, he circumcises him, which is what God had told him to do. And so we see Abraham taking very seriously God's commands and doing what God had told him to do. And then, not surprisingly, we see Abraham and Sarah rejoicing. Isaac is named Laughter. And there seems to be a play on words and even a shift in the way we think about this word. If you remember earlier on in the story, God had told them to name Isaac Laughter, or Isaac, because when Abraham was told that he was going to have a child with Sarah, he laughed. When Sarah was overheard that she was going to have a child, she laughed. And that laughter was almost a rebuke, right? When God comes and says, you're going to name the child Laughter because you laughed when I said that you're going to have a child. And there may be a little bit of a gentle rebuke there. But if there was a gentle rebuke, it's swallowed up now in the joy, because the child is named Laughter, and Sarah says, because I'm going to laugh and everybody with me is going to laugh. I can't believe that God gave me this son. And so we see this rejoicing in what God has done. And I think it's appropriate when we come to the high seasons of life to rejoice, to give thanks for God. Oftentimes we fail to show the proper joy and gratitude for God's work on our behalf. And I think those are some things, again, if you're leading this as a small group, that are worth thinking about and talking about. How do we appropriately rejoice when God brings good things our way? And why is it that sometimes we don't? Why is it that sometimes we're like the 9 lepers, right? 10 lepers are healed by Jesus. 1 comes back and rejoices and says thank you. And the other 9 just run off and get back to their lives. And so it's important that we remember, and it's probably worth thinking about and talking about, how do we enjoy the blessings that God gives without forgetting God in the process. And that can, sadly, that can be surprisingly easy to do. But the scene takes somewhat of a sad turn here in Genesis chapter 21, and that's because Isaac is mocked by Ishmael. And, if you're reading this and you're not paying close attention to the details, Sarah might seem to maybe be overreacting here. If you're just reading it through and, you're like, okay, they're brothers, right? Brothers tease each other. I had a brother. I have 2 sons. They tease each other. That's what brothers do. Why is Sarah getting all upset? She's being extra jealous about this. But if we pay careful attention to the details and we realize what this situation was, it becomes a little bit more sinister than that. The word that's used for mocking is this Hebrew word for laughter. So the play on laughter continues throughout the story of Isaac. But if we keep track of the time references, we know from Genesis 12:4 that Abraham came into the land when he was 75. Genesis 16:3, Sarah has the idea that Abraham have a child, and that's about 10 years in the land. So Abraham marries Hagar when he was about 85, and then they have a child together. So if Abraham is 100 years old when Isaac is born, that would make Ishmael 15 years older than Isaac, give or take. Isaac would likely have been weaned when he was 2 or 3 years old, and this means that when we hear Ishmael mocking, what we have is somebody who's probably 16 or 17 years old making fun of a toddler. And that's kind of a different animal, right? Sarah sees this as what it is. It's a threat to Isaac. Ishmael is older, and we know from Genesis 21:12 that he's kind of rougher. And Sarah has decided that she doesn't want Ishmael to stick around and split the inheritance with her son, Isaac. And Sarah's making kind of a legal argument here, and that is that Hagar is a slave, and because of that, her son should not have an inheritance with the legal, legitimate heir. Okay, so Hagar is a concubine. She's married to Abraham, but not in the sense of being his wife. She's his concubine, we might think of it. And because of that, Sarah's making the argument, look, Isaac will not inherit Ishmael should not inherit alongside Isaac. They're not on the same level. Now, Abraham, of course, is absolutely torn up by this, and we can certainly understand that. As the father of Ishmael, he loves his son, and why wouldn't he? As the father of Isaac, Sarah has a point. And so what is Abraham going to do? And a lot of this goes back to our previous lesson where Abraham made foolish, unbelieving choices. And one of the things that we've kind of seen throughout the story of Abraham is that oftentimes bad decisions have compounding interest. In other words, Abraham does something bad, and the sky doesn't fall. It doesn't complete disaster right away. And it seems like, in some cases, it seems like he got away with that a little bit. But as the story progresses, we begin to realize, no, there's going to be rotten fruit that comes from this. The New Testament puts it this way. It says, what you sow, you're going to reap. Abraham made the sinful, unbelieving choice to pursue this route with Hagar, and now he's in this situation where he's really in a tough spot. I mean, God's going to side with Sarah. Sarah's making here a pretty good case, and yet that requires Abraham to cast out his son, his one who is his own child. How is he supposed to do that? And once again, we see God's grace to Abraham in this, because God could have come to Abraham, and actually God could have not come to Abraham. God could have said, listen, this is your mess. You made it. You figured out. You decide whether it's better to cast out, your concubine and her son and hope that they make it, or whether you leave this rough, gruff teenager to overpower the son of promise. That's on you, buddy. You made those choices. And yet, God doesn't do that. God comes and he tells Abraham what to do. And then he's also kind to let Abraham know that he's not done with Ishmael. Ishmael is going to become a great nation too. And I think we can learn something about this, and that is that God comes to us, and even in the messes that we make, even in our own self-made disasters, as we've seen, God comes and he shows grace and he shows mercy. And living a life of faith doesn't mean that we're perfect and that we never mess up. It means that when we mess up, we come back humbly. And when we do that, when we mess up and we come to the Lord and you say, oh man, I've blown it. Please help me. Please forgive me. Please restore me. Please help me navigate the consequences of my own sinful choices. I'm so thankful that God doesn't stand back in heaven and say, nope, this is on you. You made your bed, now you got to lie in it. And that's not to say there are never consequences. Obviously, there's consequences here. Abraham does have to send his son out into the desert, but God gives him grace through those. And that leads then to our final point, and that is God's grace in our desperation. Sometimes we can get quite desperate. Hagar here becomes very, very desperate. Abraham gives her provisions for the trip, but in the end he tells her, yes, you need to go out with your son and wander in the wilderness. They're out there for a while. They run out of food. They run out of water. And so Hagar puts her son under a tree and goes away to weep. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a more desperate situation for a person to be in. A mother who is dying, a son who is dying, and a woman who's so distraught she can't even bear to watch her son die, so she leaves him behind. Hagar did what God asked her to do the last time she was out in the desert. She went back and she submitted to Sarah, and yet once again she finds herself in the wilderness ready to die. Now last time God had given her a prophecy, and she'd been overwhelmed that God had heard her. Now she's given up hope and preparing to die. And yet God comes and he speaks to Hagar and he brings her hope. Again, there's some interesting wordplay going on here, particularly with the names. Ishmael's name means God hears. And so it's kind of interesting. It says God has heard the lad. And the lad, or the young boy, is named Ishmael. God has heard, God hears. And it's again, interesting. We don't hear about Hagar crying out to God, but apparently Ishmael did, and God heard Ishmael. So God comes to Hagar and tells her that he's not done with Ishmael yet. And you've got to love the grace and the kindness of God that once again we have a rival to Isaac, and yet God is showing goodness and favor to Hagar and Ishmael. God had told Abraham, send Hagar away, but that did not mean that God was done with him. Earlier in this series, we marveled at the fact that the biblical story had stopped to spend so much time on Hagar, this runaway Egyptian slave. Now, once again, we focus on her story and that of her son as well. God is going to do something through Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac that he is not going to do through Hagar and Ishmael, but he is still going to do good to and for Ishmael. And so I think that's an important interpretational question that we should think about. Why is God doing all of this for Ishmael and his descendants? And how might this help us as we think about the rest of the Old Testament? You know, sometimes we read the Old Testament and we think to ourselves, oh yeah, you know, God, all he cared about was Israel. You know, if you were in Israel, you might as well be dead. You know, God doesn't care about you. But that's not true. God is doing something through the nation of Israel. But even as we've seen here in the story of Abraham, the goal of that ultimately is to be a blessing to all of the nations. So God is doing something through Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac that he's not doing through Hagar and Ishmael, but God still cares about Hagar and Ishmael, and God cares about the nations. And in fact, what God is doing through Abraham and Sarah and Isaac has the end goal of all of the nations. And of course, as New Testament believers, most of us probably watching this video as Gentiles, as the nations, we ought to be very thankful for what God has done in and through his chosen people, Israel, and what God continues to do through them. So, we're going to see finally that God protects Ishmael. And there's a certain irony about this passage that's kind of hard to miss. Hagar and Ishmael are wandering in Beersheba. And again, the names are really important, especially in the Old Testament, because Beersheba means a well of the oath. And so that raises an interesting question, right? If I were, and again, this doesn't come through if you're in English, but if you're reading it in Hebrew, you're reading that Hagar and Ishmael are wandering around in the area of the well of the oath, right? And you'd be thinking to yourself, well, where's the well? If that's the name of the area, the well of the oath, go find the well. And yet, it is not until God opens Hagar's eyes that she's able to see the well. Once again, she, of course, goes and gets a drink and is able to give some water to Ishmael. It's interesting that God takes care of Hagar and Ishmael in his time. They're in an area that apparently has provision, but it's not until God allows Hagar to see that that they're able to get the water that they needed. Ishmael, the rival of Isaac, the one who's cast out because he was mocking Isaac, is finally given the blessing of God. God says, my blessing is going to be upon you. Hagar goes, takes an Egyptian wife from him, which isn't surprising since she's an Egyptian. And Ishmael's life takes a different turn than his brother's, but God is overseeing his life as well. And this teaches us about God. God is good all the time. When we're feeling good, when we're discouraged, when we're sad, when we're happy, no matter what situation we find ourselves in, there's always grace from God. Whether it's the celebration of Isaac, the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac, or the care of Ishmael in the wilderness, no matter where we are, no matter who we are, God's going to provide, and God's going to protect, and God's going to be good to us. So once again, the story of Abraham is the story of a man of faith, but it's also, and perhaps even more so, it's the story of the God of grace. And God's grace is on display all throughout this passage of keeping his promises and giving wisdom and guidance, helping Abraham through his mistakes, and then taking care of somebody that perhaps if you were the original audience, you would think isn't really that important, but they were important and they mattered to God. I trust that as you study this, God will use this lesson in your life, that he will create faith in you as you study and meditate on what he's done in the life of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Hagar, and Ishmael. And may God bless all of us. And may we all enjoy the favor that he gives. And again, I trust that this will be a rich study for you. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next time as we move on to Lesson 13 and look at Abraham and the nations.